Some people die completely alone and die at peace. Others die surrounded by family and carry a grief no one can explain. Same silence, same empty room, two entirely different souls. Carl Jung spent his life studying why. And the answer has nothing to do with how many people loved you. It was decided decades earlier, quietly, invisibly, by something almost no one is taught to notice, until it is nearly too late to change it. The phone stops ringing as often as it used to. The visitors thin out. The calendar empties. And in that silence, one person finally meets someone they have been avoiding their entire life. Themselves. Jung believed that every one of us walks through the world wearing a mask. He called it the persona, the version of you built for others. The employee, the parent, the reliable one, the strong one, the one who always shows up. The persona is not a lie. It is necessary. Without it, we could not function in families, in workplaces, in a world that requires cooperation and predictability from us. But it was never meant to be the whole of you. It was meant to be a garment, not a skin. Beneath that mask, Jung said, lives an entire hidden world, the unconscious. A place where the emotions you swallowed, the griefs you postponed, the parts of yourself you rejected in order to be loved, all continue to exist, untouched, unspoken, waiting. Most people never meet that inner world, because life keeps them busy enough to avoid it. There is always another task, another person to care for, another role to play. The persona is comfortable precisely because it asks so little self-examination of us. It only asks that we keep performing, but the persona cannot last forever. Life, slowly and without asking permission, begins to remove it. Careers end. Children build their own lives. Friends move on or pass away. And underneath the mask that finally falls away, there is a face. The question Jung asks is brutally simple. Do you recognize that face, or is it a stranger's? This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, not becoming someone new, but finally becoming who you always were beneath every role you ever performed. And whether that process happened during your life determines everything about how you experience being alone at its end. Here is what makes this so urgent. Individuation does not happen automatically simply because you grow older. Age alone does not deliver wisdom. Many people reach their final years having only ever practiced the persona, having never once turned inward to ask who they were apart from what they did for others. For them, old age arrives as a kind of confiscation. Everything that once defined them is quietly taken away, and there is nothing underneath to replace it. But for those who began the inward turn earlier, even hesitantly, even imperfectly, old age arrives as something closer to arrival itself. Not confiscation, but homecoming. Picture an old tree that once gave shade to travelers, hosted birds in its branches, sheltered children who climbed it as a game. For decades, its worth seemed tied to who came to visit it. Then one season, the birds fly elsewhere. The travelers take a different road. The children who once climbed it grow old themselves and stop coming. If the tree believed its life depended on being needed, it would spend its final years convinced it had become worthless. But the tree was never fed by the people who visited it. It was fed by roots reaching quietly into the earth beneath it, drawing life from a source no one could see and no one could take away. Jung would say the human soul works the same way. Those who spent their lives drawing their sense of worth only from being needed, from applause, attention, constant company, experience solitude as starvation. Those who, somewhere along the way, built roots of their own, reaching into their own inner ground, experience the very same solitude as nourishment. The tree does not fear the empty field. It has never truly been alone, and here is something worth sitting with. The tree did not build those roots overnight, and neither do we. Roots are built slowly, underground, invisibly, long before any storm arrives to test them. The people who seem miraculously calm in old age were rarely calm by accident. They were quietly gardening their inner world for decades, usually without anyone noticing, including themselves. Jung believed that whatever we refuse to face does not disappear. It waits. Every unspoken apology, every grief we did not allow ourselves to feel, every rejected part of who we are. Jung called this the shadow. And the shadow does not vanish simply because we stopped looking at it. It moves into the basement of the psyche and waits behind a locked door. For most of life, we are too busy to hear it knocking. We fill our days with responsibility, and the noise of obligation drowns out the sound. But solitude removes the noise. That is why so many people fear being alone, not because the silence itself is dangerous, but because they know, somewhere instinctively, what is waiting behind that door. Here is the part Jung insisted we misunderstand. The shadow does not return to punish you. It returns because it wants, finally, to be understood. Every wound faced honestly loses a fraction of its hidden power over you. Every grief allowed to surface, even decades late, becomes a little lighter simply by being seen. Those who spend a lifetime opening that door gradually, gently, long before old age arrives, reach solitude with far less waiting behind it. The room is not empty, but it is no longer frightening. It has already been visited, again and again, with compassion instead of fear. There is an important distinction Jung drew that most people never learn, and it may be the difference between a solitude that heals and a solitude that harms. It is the difference between isolation and solitude. Isolation is solitude that was never chosen. It is the empty room that arrived because everyone left, because life narrowed without your consent, because circumstance took away the noise before you were ready for the silence. Isolation feels like exile. Solitude, in Jung's sense, is something else entirely. It is a relationship you build with yourself on purpose, gradually, as a form of care rather than abandonment. It is choosing, even occasionally, to sit with your own thoughts instead of reaching for the next distraction. The tragedy is that many people spend their entire lives avoiding solitude, only to have isolation forced upon them later, unprepared. They never practiced being alone with themselves when it was optional. So when it becomes unavoidable, it feels like punishment rather than homecoming. But there is good news hidden inside this distinction. Solitude is a skill. Like any skill, it can be practiced. 10 quiet minutes in the morning before the noise of the day begins. A walk without a phone in hand. An evening spent in genuine reflection rather than passive distraction. Small, repeated acts of choosing your own company. Each one is a small deposit into the same account the tree was drawing from, roots, growing quietly, underground. For a day, you cannot yet see that there is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. It is the loneliness of having built your entire sense of peace on someone else's presence. Jung observed something quietly devastating about this kind of love. Wherever the need to possess another person grows, love itself begins to shrink. The person we cling to becomes less a companion and more a shield against our own solitude. This kind of attachment feels like love. It is often mistaken for devotion. But underneath it is usually fear. Fear of being left with only yourself and finding no one there. Picture 2 trees growing beside each other. Their branches touch, their shade overlaps, they share the same rain and the same sun. But their roots remain their own, reaching separately into the earth. Neither tree depends on the other to stand. This is what Jung meant by mature love, presence without possession. Caring for someone without requiring their presence to survive your own solitude. People who learn to love this way do not experience the eventual quiet of old age as abandonment. because their peace was never rented from another person in the first place. It was always quietly their own. Consider how this plays out across an ordinary life. In youth, love often feels like merging, two people becoming one, losing the edges of themselves in each other. It is intoxicating, and it is also, Jung would say, incomplete. Real intimacy requires two whole people, not two halves searching for completion in each other. As the years pass, life tests this merging again and again. A partner becomes ill. A friend moves away. A marriage ends, by choice or by death. Every time love changes shape, the person who built their identity entirely on being loved experiences it as a kind of dying. The person who built an identity of their own, one love enriches but does not create, experiences the same change as loss. Yes, grief is real and should never be minimized, but not as annihilation. Something remains standing after the storm passes. This is not coldness. It is not learning to need people less out of self-protection. It is learning to hold love with open hands instead of closed fists, treasuring it fully while it is present, without requiring it to be permanent in order to matter. Imagine your life as an enormous library. Every year, every relationship, every failure, and every joy becomes another book placed silently on the shelf. Most people spend their entire lives collecting these books and never once opening them. They move forward, always forward, never turning around to read what has already been lived. Jung believed old age offers something almost no other stage of life can: the time, finally, to sit down and read. Not to relive the pain, but to understand it. To notice that even the most painful chapters carried a lesson that could not have been learned any other way. This is the difference between a bitter solitude and a peaceful one. The bitter version stays trapped, replaying old injuries, searching endlessly for someone to blame. The peaceful version opens the books, reads them honestly, and closes each one not with anger, but with something closer to gratitude. Those who arrive at solitude, having already read their own story, do not fear being left alone with it. They have already made peace with the author. There is a particular chapter in this library that many people leave unopened for their entire lives, because it is simply too painful to face directly. Jung called it the unlived life, all the paths not taken, the versions of ourselves we might have become, the risks we did not take, the words we did not say while there was still time to say them. Regret, left unexamined, calcifies into bitterness. But regret, faced honestly, can become something far more useful. It can become clarity about what actually mattered to us all along. The grief of an unlived possibility is strangely a kind of confirmation. We do not grieve what we never valued. If a particular unlived path still aches decades later, it is telling you something true about your own values, even now, even late. This is why Jung believed reconciliation with the past was not optional for a peaceful old age, but essential to it. Not the erasure of regret, which is impossible and perhaps even undesirable, but a different relationship with it. Regret stops being a courtroom and starts being a teacher. It stops asking who is to blame and starts asking what can still be honored. Even now, in the time remaining, Jung's later writing points, again and again, toward four quiet treasures that determine whether solitude becomes suffering or sanctuary. The first is the ability to sit in your own company without needing to escape it through noise, distraction, or constant company. The second is the courage to look honestly at your own life, including its failures, without being destroyed by what you see. The third is meaning that comes not from achievement or recognition, but from awareness, the quiet understanding of why your particular life unfolded the way it did. The fourth is emotional freedom, the capacity to love deeply without turning another human being into the only reason you can bear to be. Alive. No one arrives at the end of life with all four treasures fully formed. That is not the standard Jung was proposing, and it would be an unkind one if he were. These treasures are not a finish line. They are a direction. What matters is not perfection, but orientation, whether, across the years, a person was slowly turning toward their own depth or steadily running from it. But those who spent even a portion of their years quietly building these treasures discover something remarkable in Solitude's final chapter. The silence does not confront them with a stranger. It welcomes them home. It is worth saying plainly that none of this requires a dramatic transformation or a spiritual awakening in some grand, cinematic sense. Jung was suspicious of anything that looked too sudden, too easy. Individuation, in his experience, was slow, often uncomfortable, and rarely finished. It looked less like a lightning bolt, and more like erosion, small, repeated choices to be honest with yourself, gradually reshaping the landscape of who you are. A single evening of honest reflection will not undo decades of avoidance. But it is also true that it is never too late to begin. Jung worked with patients well into their later years who, for the first time, began this inward turn, and even then, even late, something genuinely shifted. The soul, it seems, does not close its door permanently. It simply waits patiently for someone to finally knock from the other side. There is one more room in this house worth entering before we close the door, because it quietly answers a question many people never say out loud. If so much of this inward turn happens alone, does it mean the rest of the world stops mattering? Does peace with yourself require indifference to everyone else? Jung would have said the opposite is true. He believed the deepest solitude, faced honestly, does not close a person off from others. It opens them, often for the first time, to a kind of generosity that was not possible before, because it no longer needs anything in return. Now think of someone who spent their younger years helping others in order to be needed, in order to feel worthy, in order to quiet an inner emptiness they could not yet name. That kind of giving, however kind it looks from the outside, is quietly transactional. It is love with a hidden invoice attached, but something different becomes possible for those who have done the harder work of meeting themselves first. Their giving stops being a search for validation and becomes something closer to overflow. They help not because they need to be needed, but because they have enough inside themselves to share without depleting anything essential. Jung noticed this shift especially in his older patients, and he gave it a particular kind of respect. He observed that the second half of life, when lived consciously, often produces a very different kind of contribution than the first half did. In youth, contribution tends to look like building a career, a family, a reputation, something visible and measurable. In the deeper stages of life, contribution tends to look like something quieter. Wisdom offered without being asked to prove itself. Patience extended without needing applause. Presence given simply because it can be, not because it earns anything back. This is why some of the most peaceful people you will ever meet in their later years are not withdrawn from the world at all. They are remarkably present in it. A grandmother's steady hands, an old friend's unhurried listening, a mentor's willingness to sit with someone else's confusion without rushing to fix it. Their peace with themselves did not make them selfish. It made them spacious enough to hold other people without losing themselves in the process. There is a word for this that Jung's students later used more than Jung himself, but the seed of it belongs to him. They called it generativity, the capacity to give something forward that will outlast you, not out of obligation, but out of genuine abundance. A garden tended for someone else's future harvest. A story passed down not to control how it is remembered, but simply because it deserves to be told. A kindness extended to a stranger with absolutely nothing expected in return. This is perhaps the final, quiet paradox at the center of everything we have explored together. The people who spend the most time honestly meeting themselves in solitude often become, almost without trying, the people who give the most freely to others. Not because solitude made them selfish, but because it finally made them whole enough to have something real left over to give. The tree, after all, did not stop offering shade once it stopped needing visitors to prove its worth. It simply began offering that shade freely to whoever happened to walk by, expecting nothing, needing nothing, complete enough in itself to remain generous until the very end. So we return to where we began. Why do some people who die alone die at peace, while others surrounded by family carry a grief no one can name? It was never really about who was in the room. It was about a much older, much quieter question. One Jung believed every human being eventually has to answer, whether they choose to or not. If everything that currently holds your happiness together disappeared tomorrow, would there still be someone left worth sitting with? Those who spent their lives avoiding that question do not suddenly find the answer in their final years. They meet, often for the first time, a stranger, and there is no time left to become properly acquainted. Those who faced the question earlier, even imperfectly, even painfully, meet something else entirely in that same silence. Not a stranger. Something closer to an old, familiar companion. Someone they have already learned, slowly and honestly, to call home. Perhaps this is the quiet reassurance hidden inside a difficult truth. Solitude, in the end, is not a punishment reserved for those who failed to keep enough people close. It is simply the moment when whatever relationship you built with yourself, across an entire lifetime, is finally revealed. You do not need to wait until old age to begin building it. Every honest conversation with yourself today, every buried feeling you allow yourself to finally feel, every part of your story you stop running from, becomes one more room in that home you will eventually live in alone. Whether you are ready or not, the tree does not fear the empty field. Its roots were never dependent on who stayed to admire it. Neither, in time, do you have to. If this reflection found you at the right moment, I would love to know, what is one part of yourself you have been avoiding meeting in the silence? Share it in the comments below, gently, in your own time. And if these quiet explorations of Jung's psychology speak to something in you, consider joining this small, growing community of seekers. Subscribe and walk with us as we continue reading the books that most people never open. Until the next reflection, may you learn a little more each day to be good company for yourself.